In today's episode, we speak to Donaghue Woodman from CannSun, specifically around the breaking news that South Africa is going to allow for the investigation of a phase 2 clinical trial on the use of psilocybin for safety and efficacy when treating major depressive disorder. Now, this is going to be amazing, the conversation about this groundbreaking news on the African continent, but we're also going to cover aspects related to the set and setting required around psychedelic medicine implementation. In addition, we're going to tackle the potential bright future South Africa has to play in psychedelic medicine. So today I have the pleasure of having Donaghue Woodman from CannSun on to discuss a groundbreaking event that's developed with SAHPRA, which is essentially the first approval of a phase 2 study into psilocybin-assisted therapy. Now, Donaghue, I'm going to let you give us a bit of context on, what has SAHPRA essentially allowed CannSun to look at and to pursue in a clinical context within South Africa.
Chef, just to start with a little bit of a background about our story as well as to why we embarked on this specific trial. As we know, one of our founders, Mr. David Perry, even though he's a Canadian, his heart is set on South Africa. He's South African by heart, and his main aim for ultimately starting CannSun here is he always wanted to make a difference. As you know, our cultivation facility is out in Atlantis, and the reason he also chose that space is to uplift the surrounding communities. And he said from day one, he wants to empower women and he wants to make a difference within developing countries. And we basically came up with this concept together. One of the biggest issues plaguing, the world, but South Africa specifically, is HIV. We have the highest population of HIV in the world. We have about 8.2 million people living with HIV. Of that, 62% of all new diagnosed cases is in women between the ages of 15 and 19. And that is, to me, number one, as I indicated to one of our colleagues as well. We have a nation where if you take care of your women, you take care of your nation, because we are still very much culturally and community based. Yeah. And if you look at one of the biggest comorbid diseases associated with HIV, it is major depressive disorder. Also looking at our current government states, only 5% of all government funding goes towards treating depression, anxiety, or any mental disorder. And to put it further into context, we have close to 60 million people living in South Africa. We only have 700 psychiatrists. Wow. So what that means is for every 100,000 patients, there is only 1.5 psychiatrists available, if any. And for every 100,000 patients, there are only 10 beds available for them should they be diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar or major depression or suicidal ideation. And only 1% of that is geared towards children. So to me, it's very close to my heart. I come from humble beginnings. I grew up in a small town in Middelburg, Eastern Cape. And I've always had an integration of plant medicine in my life and culture. I went on to go and study at the University of the Western Cape as well, with Prof. Quinton Johnson and Mabusela at the South African Herbal Science and Medicine Institute, where we also worked very closely with traditional healers. They also launched the first plant medicine trial that was funded by Harvard in HIV in Tygerberg. So these are issues that have always been very close to my heart, that I always wanted to make an impact or a lasting impact at the end of the day. Awesome. And it's one of the reasons why we actually chose, number one, to do a study in major depressive disorder, looking at psilocybin, but most importantly, major depressive disorder in HIV positive women, because they'll go into a clinic, they'll get their antiretrovirals, but their mental health is overlooked. And to me, if you don't treat the mind, the body falters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have to take a holistic approach to how we do this at the end of the day. Yeah. So it's been a long journey. It hasn't been easy. We submitted our application. It's almost about a year and a half ago now. And we've had challenges, without a doubt, as any psilocybin trial would, even though it's been 20 years now where we've had a lot of research coming forth. It's still very new in our country. And we're still yet to see a regulated or commercialized psilocybin to be sold in the market for the treatment of anxiety, depression, PTSD.
Yeah, fully. I mean, if we look at the North American markets and Canada and the US, like the pace had changed. Like, I mean, I think of all the work that's been done already in the 60s on LSD and other, types of psychedelics. And it was such a fascinating period of history where so much was happening. And now to see the resurgence, and I completely agree with your point about, arriving at a clinic, getting antiretrovirals, and off you go on your way, and you expect that to be a merry day. I mean, healthcare needs to move to the point of, mental health. I mean, there's so many fantastic examples about, the placebo effect, the nocebo effect, how important mindset is in terms of health, and it's so critical, and there isn't enough discussion on it. And to see the resurgence in psychiatry in the US, away from just traditional SSRIs to like now all these options that are still to be mapped and fully understood. I mean, a lot of work has happened, but to see the clinical evidence now moving aggressively and seeing MAPS, the organization in the US, driving it aggressively as well, it's amazing to know what we can expect to see in the next year or two from the outcome of all these clinical investigations. And it is truly groundbreaking. And I think the whole community is appreciative of the fact that everyone, yourself particularly, have been pushing to get SAHPRA to look at, let's call it psychedelically assisted therapies and clinical investigations. And this is amazing because it is progressive. For us to have sit for another couple years and left it, let the rest of the Northern Hemisphere sort it out would have been just a bad choice. So I'm glad to see this. In terms of the investigative periods, because a lot of people are going to be asking, okay, the trial's going to start soon. How long is going to be the journey in terms of how long are you guys looking to evaluate and then, release that information over what do you see the lifetime of the trial to be?
So we're looking at about 30 patients, and each patient will be inducted into the trial for about 3 months. So we're not going to wait until we have all 30 patients for the patient pool, because as you diagnose a patient with major depressive disorder, ethically, you have to start them on treatment. So all in all, we're looking at about an 8-month period, after which we will be publishing the results as well.
Awesome, excellent. And I believe you're working with Task, the CRO, as well as the University of Stellenbosch in terms of collaboration.
Absolutely. So Task, even though they are a local clinical trial organization, they are conducting very important trials in terms of COVID, in terms of tuberculosis. They are looking to expanding into Europe as well. And then they're also working very closely with the Department of Psychiatry at Stellenbosch to assist with the clinical trial as well.
Okay, awesome. Now, I want to talk about a topic, and I mean, setting is quite a familiar term when it comes to anyone who's worked with, specifically, let's call it psychiatric, facilitated psychedelics, like the importance of the set and the setting. Can you unpack that for the audience? Because I think often people think of a product where you take a tablet and you're off your merry way, and that's that's how you treat for it. Often when it comes to the use of psychedelics in psychiatry, it's almost a relationship between the integrative process. Talk us through maybe set and setting, just briefly, to give people at home a bit of context on this. And it's definitely worth doing more research for anyone at home who wants to get into more of the knowledge behind the psychiatric support network here. Yeah.
Absolutely. So firstly, for the first time for a long time in history, we are now seeing the congruence between psychotherapy and the administration of medicines. Previously, this has never been done. As you said, patients would previously get their SSRI, be sent home, and that's as far as it goes. And we are seeing a resurgence where there is a more holistic approach where patients, and whether they want to call it a sitter, whether they want to call it an assisted psychotherapist, whether it's a shaman, depending on where you will be receiving your psychedelic therapy. For the first time, these two are given together. The term set and setting was basically coined by John Appleseed and then further promoted by Timothy Leary. And I think it forms the crux of psychedelic therapy. And it's the most important part of psychedelic therapy. Number one, set, which refers to the patient's mindset, but I would also like to bring in heart set, because that's where we carry our fear. That is where we carry most of our emotions, if you look at from a shaman perspective as well. So if a patient has got a lot of issues that, number one, they haven't previously dealt with, or they haven't spoken about, or they haven't practiced journaling or mindfulness or meditation, and they embark, whether it's their own journey of psychedelics or whether in a setting, they won't necessarily get that benefit.
Yeah.
And the setting as well, to me, it's so important, because if a patient or individual walks into any place or setting, be it the Amazon, be it a clinical setting, and it's not warm and it's not inviting and it doesn't instill trust, they will have what is also termed a bad trip.
Yeah.
Because if that trust is not there, doesn't matter whether the psychologist or psychiatrist or clinical psychologist follows a Freudian method or a Jungian method, or whether they take a more shaman approach, a holistic approach. If there is no trust, then the benefit of having that therapy won't be to the advantage of the patient. And I think a lot more emphasis, especially in South Africa, has to be put onto set and setting. Because if I look at our current, not only private, but governmental structure, it's not there. It is not adapted or equipped to be able to administer these medicines within a government setting, number one, which is where most of our people actually need it, or private. A lot of psychiatrists, if they want to administer these medicines, or clinical psychologists, will need to completely convert their practice. And these are a lot of issues that we do foresee, and we do intend on assisting in this space, whether it is with rolling out near-term future clinics or trainings as well. These things needs to be in place. It's not good enough to say we've got this therapy, we're going to be running out a clinical trial, if we haven't focused on getting the fundamentals right by the time that these clinical trials reaches their phase 3. There has to be the necessary fundamental groundwork done within both the natural medicine as well as mainstream medicine, as well as governmental settings.
Yeah, I fully agreed. I mean, the thing here as well for me in South Africa is there's such a need for job creation. And I look at this as an example. I mean, what's the point in having multiple individuals unemployed, at home, depressed, when we could implement policies and plans around how to train someone to be, a psychiatric assistant to some extent, or a sitter, and then start to implement these uses of psychedelics in assisted therapy, and then we've got an abundance of labor for this specific outcome, and then everyone just starts to look at this, and if regulatory bodies look at how to implement this, there's a holistic approach to medicine. It's going to be, there's so much opportunity to see this. I mean, I'd love nothing more than to see more clinics and more local individuals brought in that are maybe not always just qualified nurses, because in this regard, it's one of, you need a very base, you need to have more of a personal warmth and almost a nurturing. And if we look at healthcare, I mean, this has all been based on just this nurturing aspect to it. And I think it supports psychiatric activities very well. So I'm really excited to see what happens. Do you anticipate that on the back of this, I know that we'll all be advocating for it, but do we expect to see more clinical trials taking place in South Africa? I mean, let's maybe use the example. I believe this the psilocybin you guys will be using is sourced from the US, so it's pretty normal to see like international drug development getting to Africa. And because we're the Rainbow Nation, we tend to have this great genetic diversity that allows us to now conduct very comprehensive clinical trials. Do you expect more of these? I mean, I would hope nothing more than see South Africa become a hub for a lot of these type of investigations from, not just, the usual suspects like MDMA, DMT, psilocybin, LSD, but also like some of these novel candidates that are being developed in the North American market. Do you see that developing here?
Absolutely, Jeff. Number one, there's just been this huge, like you would say, this huge focus on MDMA, DMT, psilocybin. At the end of the day, where we live, which is South Africa, has such a vast array of number one plant medicine. Yeah. Our culture is still so ingrained in cultural in the treatment and use of plant medicine in treating patients. I would love for nothing more for us to actually see vertical supporting industries number one in terms of manufacturing, because at the end of the day, our people need these medicines and we need it to be cost effective. Yeah. We want equality and we want equal access. We don't want this to be another story where only the top 25 or the top 2% gets access to these medicines, because they have the ability to heal. Yeah. And they have the ability to heal our nation and help our people. And if we don't get the necessary backing of the universities, of the regulatory authorities, of our private and public professors, then we can't make this work. We cannot also approach this in isolation, because we can't go at it alone. Number one, as well, as we spoke about, education. Right now, if a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist just wants to get trained to be able to administer these therapies, they have to travel all the way to the States just to go and get MAPS trained. And the training that is available online, the cost is so exorbitant they can't afford it. So number one, there has to be a foundation for local education. We have to get the buy-in of both the government and the regulatory authorities to actually set up local research hubs as well as manufacturing facilities. We have to open ourselves up to also local psychedelic medicines that could also assist us in Africa. I mean, there is more research going on in terms of iboga in the States, which is from Africa by the Bawiti tribe, than we've ever done in Africa in itself. And to me, that's so sad. Yeah. We have to recognize what we have, and in terms of whether it's plant medicine, whether it's expertise, because there's an abundance of that. And we should approach this integratively and as a collective. It's not enough to say that, yes, we're a company, we're here to set up a clinical trial, because we cannot do this if the universities doesn't have the necessary educational structure to actually teach this to undergraduate students, because that's where it begins. We cannot do this if we don't have the support of private clinicians, or if we don't support them in getting that necessarily training and education down here to South Africa. We cannot do this if we don't have the buy-in of the governmental institutions to actually convert some of these hospitals and get more expertise to actually treat patients, and to actually assist psychologists, whether it's financial assistance or psychiatrists from a government perspective, to actually convert their practices to administer these medicines, and also to set up facilities in outlying areas. Because if we only have 700 psychiatrists, of which the majority is working in private, we've already failed. We failed our people.
Yeah, and I get you there. I mean, it's... Yeah, this is the part where there's so much to be done. Like, and it's great to have you on to discuss this, because what I think it does is it creates a lot of awareness. very often, and I mean, I've seen this through the journey with plant-based medicine, specifically cannabis, like overcoming stigmas and getting to the next level of education. And I have a feeling that all these products are going to go through the same, all the psychedelic plethora of products are going to go through the same journey, and we're just at the tip of what is going to be possible. But I agree with you on the education. Start at the universities, get buy-in, and then it also stimulates the interest in psychiatry, because I think psychiatry has been somewhat of a dead field. Not to insult any psychiatrists, there probably will be a couple watching, but it's been the options, and I understand this. I mean, I think it was Professor David Nutt or someone spoke about this, where it was like, psychiatry has always been one of those fields where it's just like students don't want to study it because there aren't options to really help patients besides very old SSRIs. And now it's become this new interest. Universities are giving all these options available in the space, and I think that's fantastic, because recognizing the importance of mental health and exploiting therapeutics to support that is definitely going to be the future. I mean, there's no debate about this if you know anything about development of society and concepts and constructs. So for me, I'm super excited to see what's going to happen. I want to talk about the Kingdom of Lesotho. Now, we know that there's been a few licenses issued for commercial psilocybin production in the Kingdom of Lesotho. So for anyone watching who doesn't know, that's within, obviously, the borders of South Africa. We are hoping, I anticipate at some point, that SAHPRA might also be more open to issuing licenses in this space. I agree that the point of issuing licenses shouldn't be primarily for the export market, as we've often seen in certain countries. It should be focused on that transition to clinical investigation and implementation locally, and hopefully with that, the training up of new psychiatrists in the space. Do you expect that these are discussions that are happening, that it's probably likely that, with successful clinical trials, I'm sure the regulator will also have this sense that maybe, commercially backing the space from a cultivation standpoint might make sense. Do you think that's fair?
100%, Jeff. And firstly, I honestly do think that the field of psychedelics is about to disrupt psychiatry. I think within the next 5 to 10 years, psychiatry won't have the same face anymore. Yeah. Because even if a psychiatrist or psychologist does not adapt or want to administer psychedelics, the way they would treat their patients would be very different. Yeah. And I think this is one of the major contributions that psychedelics will also be making within the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we have a lot to learn from our cannabis industry, as well from a regulatory perspective, as to why we want to grow these natural medicines. And it is to boost our industry. It is to grow our expertise and improve on our research and development within our country. And I think that we are just as good as Europe, just as good as the US. And it's just about getting the necessary regulatory and governmental support for us to be able to do that.
Awesome, excellent. Fully agreed on all those points. I wanted to ask a quick question related to, what's next in the pipeline. I mean, obviously, I think the most pressing thing is the outcome from this clinical investigation, and that would inform a lot of the next steps. Are there any other interesting steps that are next? I mean, traditionally, there's that aspect that there is a cannabis company here as well, CannSun. I'm glad to see the diversification in the portfolio. Anything new that's on the horizon, or is it one where we just need to wait and see?
Well, absolutely. We actually have a few projects in the pipeline. So we have or will be recently or launching CanHealth MD within the next 2 months. It's geared towards cannabis education for both patients and doctors. We will be doing the same for psychedelic medicines as well. Education, to me, it's key. Otherwise, everything else will falter. So we'll be running that in congruence. We do have other 2 very near-term clinical trials that we will also be working on in the mental health space as well, looking at schizophrenia and traumatic brain injury. So once that is signed off, we'll definitely be having this conversation again. But there's phenomenal things coming.
No, awesome. I mean, there's so much. I mean, I know major depressive disorder is a big subject by itself, but there's so many different investigative avenues for indication to look at. So I'm really excited to see, what comes next in terms of the pipeline. What are the new projects, and I'm sure we're going to have you back on soon again to talk about the progress of the trials, maybe, or if that's not allowed, at the end of the trials, the conclusion. But definitely excited to see the future of the psychedelic environment within Southern Africa and South Africa. It's really an exciting space. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, Donaghue.
Cheers. Thank you. Please go well.